We are live. We are so good at streaming. Amazing. Welcome back, friends and fans. What do we call this? We'll call it Ergotalk today. We're the Ergonauts, and we're going to discuss working better together with technology. And specifically today, inspired by a comment from the last stream, there's this notion of how having metrics and seeing data when you're not empowered to make changes to that data, especially if you're incentivized on some model. And there's this thing called the red bead experiment, which we should talk about a little bit. So there's this individual tyranny that I think is very interesting. And then I also think we should get to the tyranny, the organizational tyranny that happens when people get locked into some model that they're chasing, and maybe there's red flags and other opinions or conflicting data, but they just march off the cliff because this is the model that we're set up to play. So that's the kind of the foundation. There's a bunch of quotes about measurement from we'll call them the shoulders of giants. The Deming, Akoff, Ellie Goldratt type stuff talking about measurement is interesting. And one of my favorite ones that I saw it in a slide Jabe made the other day, talking about balance metrics, systems of balance metrics. But this is a classic. Tell me how you measure me, and I'll tell you how I will behave. If you measure me in an illogical way, don't complain about illogical behavior. So that's a famous quote by Goldratt, theory constraints, all that. So that's the setting. That's the table that's set. So where are we going to take this adventure?
Yeah, so I can rant about metrics for a really long time. I considered writing a talk about it because there's like literally at least 10 different ways to like screw up metrics, and like very identifiable, and I talk about it sometimes here and there, but like there's like a long laundry list. And the ironic thing is, like, it's not that hard to get it right, but like we so infrequently do, right? And like I think Jay, again, we keep mentioning the balance metrics, but that's the whole secret sauce. Like, you just have to be looking at more than one thing at a time, and again, be cognizant about when you're looking at it and who's looking at it and who's empowered to take action. But so a couple things. So one thing that on the empowerment, I know, like, back when we were like talking at Dope Days about incident management a lot, we used to there was a lot of like painful stories about people who get called into incident management in the middle of the night and then don't have the rights to perform the action that needs to be performed. And that's like the worst situation you can be in, right? You're like there at 3 a.m. trying to fix an incident, except you literally cannot do the thing that needs to get done because you literally don't have the right, like, the permissions to perform the action. So like we spent a bunch of time talking about like how, if you're already putting people on call, make sure that everyone who's on call has the permissions to do the things that need to get done.
I think that is an acute pain that is obviously painful, but I almost feel worse, or the experience of the long, slow grind where you watch the slow train wreck, right? Where you see the airplane is going into the side of the mountain, and you want everyone to fly.
The Titanic.
Yeah, whatever the metaphor here for the disaster, but I feel like that's almost worse, and I think that's even more common, that you have these unstated assumptions about what your job is. Sometimes they're stated, they're explicit, but you could fix something, or the organization could fix something, but for whatever reason, there's not enough social capital to make meaningful changes because we're just gonna let it go. I think that's almost more painful to me than it's the
I
long.
think you're right, and like I just have this misguided belief that you can, win this game. So like if you escalate enough and you tell enough stories to enough people, that you can like actually move the organization in a positive direction with those metrics you're looking at. But you're right, it's not always the case. Sometimes you just sit there and like, you become a Cassandra and people like stop listening to you and they're just like, shut up and collect your paycheck. We're going where we're going.
I think like one of the, kind of like one of the meta things that I've seen a bunch of times that's related to like empowerment and metrics is literally the inability to change the metric itself. In other words, like, hey, I'm down here in the coal mine, chipping away at the pickaxe, and you're measuring, dynamite explosions per hour. But you're not measuring how many pickaxe strokes are getting stuck on the ceiling. Like, let me give you a hint. If you want to make this thing more efficient, you need to make sure that the ceiling is high enough for me to swing my pickaxe. That's much more important than how much dynamite you're blowing up. But I don't have a way of changing the metric system around to make that visible to other people. So I think that's one thing. Like the idea that the metric system or the measurement system is being imposed by people who aren't actually in the work environment or in the work condition that's being measured. I think that's one of the ways that people get disempowered. And then the second thing is that I think that like, we've been talking a lot about kind of local and global and these other things. I think often there's measurements that are very important to a team that are not important at the team of teams level. They're just like, that's a measurement that's important to your team. It's not a measurement that's important elsewhere. And the global metrics get more emphasis because it seems to apply wider, right? But some of the local metrics might be the most important things for that particular team to be successful. There's like this weird balancing act. Of course, the most extreme version of that is overloaded metrics, where the global metric and the local metric are different. So, the classic example of that is story point nonsense, where my local story point is not equivalent to your local story point, but somehow someone decides to average them at a global level and try to measure, improvement that way.
I think the velocity of the team.
Velocity is my favorite metric to pick up on because it's so bad. It's like the idea is good and well intentioned, but like the metric is constantly doing harm. I think it's not doing harm. It's more like it like allows a bunch of people to make a bunch of statements about the productivity, which have nothing to do with the reality.
Yep. Or to measure, one team against another and say this team's doing better than that team because of a made up number.
So I think we're kind of circling around the problem. And to me, the generic issue is related to this tension between the practitioners and the truth that they have to deal with, and then this kind of central planning or executive strategy. And what I think we could do, both ourselves and our audience a favor is like, how do we connect that, or how do we balance that tension between the different levels of detail, the different time scales for the decision making, the different levels of responsibility? Because I think this is the question that comes out when people are like, if you went to the highest level in all these organizations where there's someone at the bottom who's frustrated because they see the writing on the wall, they're the Cassandra, and you ask them what's the most important thing, you're often going to get some platitudes about how our people are the most important thing, and we want everyone to do the right thing. But then there's all this kind of calcified system in place that makes it so it's very difficult for someone to change what is the system, right? This is the argument that Deming makes with the red bead experiment. For people who aren't familiar, I think it's worth the 2-second explanation. Deming used to do this all the time. John Willis has been doing it at some DevOps days recently. But you basically have this workflow where there's a bunch of beads in a box. And statistically, there's more white beads than red beads. And red beads are quote unquote defects. And the job is to take a tray and put it into the box and then pull it up with the beads they're seated in the different slots for the beads, and then you count how many red beads you have. And the object lesson is that it's the system that's producing those red beads, the errors, defects, whatever. It's not that individual putting the tray, right? And you could try to game it a little bit, but if it's set up right, it's pretty hard to not get random distribution of red beads. So at what level is our organization, one, just a stochastic process anyway, and two, rewarding people for that probabilistic outcome, which is not necessarily related to their performance.
Yeah,
go ahead, Sasha.
No, it's funny. I think there's a lot of that, like randomness looks like patterns to the naked eye. Like humans like to create coherent stories, and then like the human error is like sometimes you like read these sort of incident reports from people, and like they blame human error, and like you see the whole story being about the system and what's been automated inside the system, and then like the moment it breaks, like, oh, the human did it. Like, no, like you literally created this ramp that you had to go up on, and then like of course you fall down at the end of it, and like you built it this way. Like there's no other way for a human to go, but like yeah, it's a human error to create an incident.
So I'm not a big zealot about not using the term human error, which they do. There are the zealot people in the DevOps conversation, but at the same time, you got to be mindful of the system that is creating the possibility, the potential for those mistakes to be made.
So I mean, just to add one more layer to it that I see in most organizations, that most organizations have a hard time like seeing at first, is not one system, or different teams are in different parts of the system, and therefore their performance is determined on the context that they're in. So just as an example, if I were measuring lead time, like so lead time is just how responsive a team is, like how long it takes them to start a task, or if I were measuring throughput, how many widgets they put out per team, right? If I look at something like an operations team, well, I need very low lead time and reasonably high throughput in order for the operations team to be successful, because the nature of the work that they're doing in the system is, pretty spontaneous, relatively like things are not going well. I'm not like a lot of my operations tasks are like putting the system back in stable states as opposed to trying to, change the state entirely, stuff like that. So that type of work looks very different than if I go to a development team and I say, okay, so the throughput I'm measuring from you is how many features you put out every 2 weeks, blah, blah, blah. And so if you look at the curve, the distributions of throughput and lead time for both these teams, one will be like really spiky and one will be wider and flatter. And that's because of the nature of the work, not necessarily the nature of the team. And really good teams, when you're trying to figure out which type of work to deploy to different teams, when you're like a manager trying to figure out which type of work to give to which type of teams, if you give a team that's used to very kind of pretty predictable, pretty spiky, short-term work, like an operations team, versus pretty unpredictable, more probabilistic, like it's not sure if it'll work or not, and we're not sure how long it'll take to build type work. If you mix those, the work across those teams, you get radically different outcomes because the teams themselves optimize for different types of work systems. So when we're measuring something, it's not just that we have to measure and realize that that the system or the nature of the work is part of what drives the outcomes, the measurements that we see. It's also that we have to notice that there's different kinds of teams that will have their own types of curves and predictabilities and probabilities built into them. And so then I think that just the last thing I wanted to add in there is that then the trick is to say that just because something's probabilistic, as in like I can't have a specific defined outcome like 10 story points per sprint. I can have expected distributions. In other words, in general, this team will be performing according to its normal way of performing if it's within this distribution. If it's well outside that distribution, something's changed, something's different. And so that means that I need to go kind of hunt for those parts of the system that are acting outside of their normal distributions. And I might be hunting because a team is performing better than its normal distribution. So I might go to that team and be like, hey, like, did the nature of the work change? Did some of the process change? Did the work, like the quality of the work that you're receiving change? Like, what happened here that caused you to shift your distribution? Or the other way, like, okay, so this team's their normal distribution's being shifted out in a way that we don't like. What happened? Did the type of work that they're getting changed? Blah blah blah. Anyway,
I want to add one little caveat or nuance to what you're just saying, which is in operations, which there's longer conversation about how that's the most tactical and necessary work that happens. There is a significant fraction. I mean, hopefully you could drive that fraction lower and lower. That is unplanned, interrupt-driven work. Right?
That's
so
right.
that's a very different thing than when you're trying to pull project work off of some backlog or what have you.
Absolutely.
I kind of want to, like, there's a lot of prior art, and I think that it's interesting when we have conversations with different groups, different people, where they are with some of the vocabulary. But we've already kind of mentioned some stuff from Lean, and one thing that I think is really interesting related to this is the idea of an and-on chord, or the this kind of like prior art, and it's a model that I think is interesting, which may or may not resonate with people who aren't familiar with that. So I think it's probably worth the 2-second version explanation of that. I think Jay is probably good for explaining the and-on chord real quick.
Sure. So in Toyota factories, I don't know if this is necessarily true today. I assume it is, but for a while, at least, they had something called an and-on chord. And the and-on chord at every workstation, so everywhere where someone was working on the car directly or on a tooling device, there'd be a cord. If you pulled the cord, it stopped the entire factory. So it's not just stopping your thing, it stops the entire factory. And a manager comes over really quickly and says, okay, so what are you seeing? Like, what's happening? They try to learn really quickly, and they try to reset the situation and get the system started again. But they do that only after they understand what the problem was, so that then they can try to figure out how to make sure that problem doesn't occur anymore. And we tell this to American people or software engineers. You can ask them, like, how often do you think the and-on chord gets pulled? And most people guess, like, I don't know, like once or twice a day, or like 10 times a day. It's like hundreds of times a day, like all the time when they first start the systems. They pull these cords a lot, and they're rewarded for pulling them. If not, nobody comes over and is like, dude, you can't stop the line anymore. They're actually told, oh, you have seen something in the system that can be improved. Thank you. Thank you for helping us improve the system. And that is the basis of the and-on chord theory, is that it allows the manager to go directly into a situation that's problematic and observe it directly and try to help solve it.
So I think this particular thing and some of the other Toyota practices, but like this probably more than anything, always makes me think about the mindset differences, right? And cultural differences, because like I know many factories have tried to implement this in the US, and I don't think it worked, right? And that is because we are much more punitive in nature, right? So like if you stop the line, then you're more likely to be blamed, especially if you did it a number of times a day, right? Like, so what's wrong with you, Sasha? Why are you stopping production, right? Yeah. And this is a mindset switch that like is very difficult to execute. So like you can explain it as much as you want, but like you have to get everyone in that factory on board, all the managers, all the line workers, like everyone, to contradict what like they sort of go with naturally, and to start doing something else. And I just feel like that is, I don't know, I haven't heard stories of its implementation in the US that would signal to me that it was anywhere as successful as Toyota. And then
So,
I also want to
good.
I want to say, like, there is a Jack Welch story that's stuck in my brain related to this. That is, like, at one point, he went to this factory and there was like some people retiring, and this, you know, old guy retiring told him, you know, you've used my hands for 40 years. You could have had my brain for free. And so, like, it just kind of to quintessentially, like, this person knows the most about the work down on the floor, and like he felt like every suggestion he made was unheard by the layers of management, and like he could probably do more to improve the work than anyone trying to decide from up above like what the improvement should be.
Yep.
That's the slow grind.
I mean, the classic kind of lean response to the first things that Sasha is the NUMMI plant, right? So the NUMMI plant was taken from being literally the least well-performing plant in the United States, like by far. They were notorious for having beer bottles in the doors of their cars. In other words, you buy a new car and you hear a rattle, and they take the door apart and find like beer cans and shit in the door handles because people were drinking at work and throwing the trash in the cars that they were manufacturing. And the NUMMI plant was taken over. John Shook was there. And within, I think it was 6 to 12 months, it became the top performing plant in the world. And it was based on the fact that the managers were taught how to learn better. And that then once the managers allowed people to learn and allowed people to say, hey, like, this is how we could do this better, the system kind of flywheeled itself into place. Now, you know, the NUMMI plant is currently owned by everybody's best friend, who makes the funny electric cars, Elmo. But so it didn't last forever. But there is examples of it. It's not simply just an American cultural thing. It's American management methods.
But my response to add to what you just said to the setup, that it's the socio part of the socio-technical system. If you just get, and I think you see this over and over in a lot of the work that we're trying to do with the technology adoption, if you just add new tools, if you just add new ideas, but you haven't made the socio system line up to take advantage of them, then you're not going to get the advantage from them.
Great. I mean, one of my favorite, really quick, my favorite Toyota sensei stories. I met a Toyota sensei who was working in a theory constraints organization in the United States. And I said, hey, so like, what's the biggest difference between working at Toyota as a sensei and working in a theory constraints shop as a coach? And he said, well, at Toyota, there's the Toyota way, and it hasn't changed in like 60 years. So if you get a new manager, they have the same ideas, the same methods, the same thoughts. They're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to do the Toyota way. In the United States, every 6 to 12 months, you get a new manager who thinks the only way that they can prove they're a good manager is to change everything. So there is no way in the United States. There's like the local guy, new person way, and then in 6 to 12 months, it's going to change again. How do you get any consistency or improvement when every 12 months you change the nature of the work constantly? So he was like, that's his biggest problem in the United States compared to Toyota, is that there's just no one way of thinking about it. And it has something to do with, again, with understanding the way that like Toyota uses asymptotic goals and stuff like that. They have like the idea of single piece flow is something they pursue that is not achievable. But they can always improve in that direction.
So I want to bring this up because right now it sounds like we're dunking on United States mindset, right? And like one of the very impactful books that I read recently was The Weirdest People in the World. The research came out a number of years ago, so I saw that paper at some point, but now there is an actual book, and it talks about like actually boatloads of research. So what the person did is like he noticed that all of the research we do is done on Western educated, rich students. Like that's who's available for psychological research, right? So we study those people over and over and over again, and base all of our psychological, like, with how altruistic people are, or how like generous people are, or what kind of cognitive biases people have on that population. And then he went into many different places in the world, and then his students went into many different places. So now is actually quite a lot of research, and he observed that the psychology of people is actually different. And so some of the cognitive biases, like if you read the Thinking Fast and Slow, some of these cognitive biases mentioned in that book are not actually present in different places in the world, or are present in different levels. So like we're not actually that uniform, and culture has as much to do with what we do and how we do it as inherent like nature versus nurture psychology. But so it's a very long intro to what I wanted to say is he actually talks a lot about Western values and how they came to be and how they enabled the Industrial Revolution and a lot of the advancement that we have. And it's precisely because we're much more individualistic, right? So we are much more invested in winning the game, like sort of, and like we have broke with tradition and wanted to innovate and share that innovation. So there was a huge drive at one point in sort of Europe and adjacent places to innovate, learn from each other, migrate, like urbanize, all of that stuff. That's like a lot that plays into it. But we actually, so there is a reason a lot of countries have copied sort of Western values, because it actually worked in many situations. So Western values in general are desirable in many situations because, again, there's something to say about like if you are in traditional patriarchal society, that everything gets decided by that godfather, and like literally if you think something different, like your opinion doesn't matter, right? So you can't really innovate. Anywho, long story short, I don't think we're dunking on precisely American way, but there are differences in culture that, like, I think right now what's happening in America and a lot of the West, but like definitely very much in America, is we're focused on the shorter and shorter time horizon, and that's now impacting us in a negative way. So like there's like a difference, be like a scale between 100, focusing on 100 years outcomes and a like 1 quarter outcomes, and I think 1 quarter is too short for most businesses and most ventures to succeed.
I think from a engineering science perspective, it's good to think about the trade-offs and the potential pathologies of the different models and the different cultures, right? It's not obviously, I think, and we all have U.S. passports. It's hard to argue that there haven't been some advantages. So it's just about thinking through what are the potential pathologies and what are the things that we can use for our benefit. Related to that, and one of the things I think it comes up in a lot of weird conversations, or I think maybe I cause a lot of weird conversations, but people in a business context sometimes like to talk about OODA loop and going faster, especially when you start talking about metrics and having this thing. But I've argued in front of the Air Force, honestly, that it doesn't make sense to talk about OODA loops until you have explicit models, right? So if you know the story of OODA loop and John Boyd, he's this trainer that teaches people how to fly aircraft and like have dogfights and do all that stuff. But before he's talked about the OODA loop, he wrote this whole manual called the Aerial Attack Study, which is all about metrics. Honestly, it's like you get out the protractor and you look at the angle and you have all these numbers about how fast the aircraft can turn and how the thrust and all these things. And so when you have these two relationships, then you have these options, right? And these options are good and these options are bad, but it gives you a model that you can make decisions against. I think a lot of times you have organizations, and maybe there's models at different layers, but they don't have a clean way to make a decision given all the metrics, right? So there's or the metrics that they're driving don't necessarily correlate to the decisions that they're making. That's a long-winded way to talk about. There's this article that we've been discussing in our little private chat that I think is interesting talking about the destruction of value that happened with Nike. And it was all data driven, right? So if you go to the root cause of it is essentially that they made this decision to burn the boats and go all in on this digital transformation, which by most accounts, they successfully did what they set out to do. It's just that the model that they had been basing their decisions off was wrong, provably wrong.
Right.
So I don't know.
And then it's interesting because again, it's an external account of something that happened inside a company that we sort of know a little bit of by virtue of news and the financial results and whatever. And the interesting thing there too, I thought, was that it looked like it was successful for long enough that they literally like kept going all in on making certain changes until it stopped working. And then like once you just destroy value in certain ways, it's like really hard to get it back. Like you can just destroy 100 years of expertise very quickly by getting rid of people and departments, but it's very difficult to restore that.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I think about like the Boyd models and stuff like that, sometimes I talk about performance envelopes and stuff like that for teams. So like, sometimes when I see somebody who's about to do a transformation and they tell me what it needs to do, we need to make this many more widgets per hour or whatever. And you ask like, do you have any idea of like how your current teams perform in relationship to these metrics? Like, you want to improve reliability, or you want to like, do you know what the baseline is at all? Do you have a theory of like how it currently operates? Because like, it's one thing to ask an organization to improve some metric like reliability by 2 or 3% per quarter or something like that. It's another thing to say like, we need to improve it by 50% in the next month. So this has to do with this idea that like each team has these performance envelopes, these kind of distributions of their ability to perform within and stay in control. And so, if you don't know what the performance criteria is for a team, what the performance envelope is for a team or for a group, how do you know how fast to tell them to go or how slow to go or how much to change without breaking? It would be like, giving someone a B-52 and telling them to go into a dogfight. Like it's the wrong performance envelope, man. Like you're
B-52 cocktail or so no, I want to bring it back to Nike because I thought that was a super interesting article for multiple ways, but like it made me question if a lot of digital transformations sort of go in similar ways, right? So there were a few things in there, like the decisions that were made. Again, this is a coherent story written from with hindsight and written from outside of the company, but they went all in on direct to consumer. They went all in on centralized marketing and sales. So instead of having local and sports specific or country specific marketing and sales, they went all in on central marketing and sales, which sounds good, right? It sounds like it's ridiculous to have a marketing department in every different spot of the world, but then you are kind of destroying this specific expertise that you have in the relationships that you have in favor of something centralized that is like, I'm marketing a shoe. A shoe is a shoe is a shoe to everybody, and I'm trying to generate the most generic thing that appeals to everyone in the world that should buy my shoe. There was a third component.
I think it would be fun to break into some of the metrics from the article, but first I want to connect what Jay was going, like this notion of the performance envelope. Usually you explain that with kind of like race cars on a track. And can you make that turn, right? Are you driving an F1 or are you driving, the Yugo or whatever? And I think that's what's interesting about the Nike story. And we can get into some of the stuff Sasha started to enunciate here, is that they made the turn that they wanted to make, right? They made the turn. They had the performance under this model that they thought was going to lead to these outcomes, but their model was wrong. And
Yep.
so it ends up being like they kept the car on the track, they made the turn. It was just a bad track. It wasn't the
Well,
right.
and it goes sort of like if you're doing this sort of DevOpsy way, right? Then you make small adjustments over time and you see how they go. You don't just go like all in, let's, fire every local marketer that we have, right? But also I'm questioning again, talking about metrics, even if you made the smaller changes, because the organization tends to bubble up good news, right? Like, how long does it take you to actually realize you're doing the wrong thing? Because like, there's two dynamics. One is it probably worked for them better than normal because of the pandemic, because there was tail end of the pandemic, so a lot of things were still digital, stores were still not doing too well, right? And then when the CEO announces a big transformation, people on the ground want to make it work, right? So they will bubble up good news as much as they can until they can't, right? So it's like, how much of this is actually data driven and like your system continues to report that you're on the right track until you're not?
This is the other side of the tyranny, right? On one side, you have the tyranny of the individual that's not empowered, trapped in this system of metrics. On the other side, you have the decision making that's a slave to some model that's not being revisited, right? You don't have that second loop, the double loop learning, because there were probably indicators. In fact, I would imagine that there were people saying all along, predicting, the Department of I told you so was probably present in some of those conversations. It's just that prevailing enthusiasm that you were just mentioning made it impossible for those voices to be heard.
Yep.
I mean, I think, this is like a classic three-body problem in organizational design, right? And the three-body design, the three-body problem I'm talking about is it's not just a pendulum, right? It's like there's a wiggle that happens inside org design. And the wiggle tends to be between functionalization, regionalization, and consumerization. And what I mean by that is, should the organization be primarily driven by functions, in which case we believe that skill sets are particularly valuable in this particular market. So we need to give people alignment around functions so that they can drive their time and effort and energy into learning a particular function really well. And then we just have to integrate the functions. Is it localized? So are there significant legal barriers or cultural barriers between different parts of the globe that we're selling to that mean that we have to have localized representatives to help us with the legal functions, with the local marketing and cultural issues, etc. And then there is the consumerization. Should we organize ourselves around particular customers? And in a lot of organizations right now that take the value stream theory seriously, they're basically realigning their organizations around customers. Like they're trying to get all of the system to streamline into a particular customer base, right? That's a particular way of organizing things. And when you look at what happened at Nike, it's interesting because they basically sacrifice their localization and they globalize their customer base. In other words, they actually limited the types of customers to men, women, and children. So that's the only customers that they weren't talking about, like basketball players or soccer players. That's their high level measurement is men, women, and children. And then they functionalize by eliminating redundancies in the different parts of the organization. And so you can see that kind of like ends up swirling itself around in this kind of way of achieving a global company, a globalized company, which I think is just super interesting right now because so many other companies are trying not to do that as much. Like it seems like the globalized company, this kind of
I watched a CNBC review of like direct to consumer story at one point, and it was very interesting. So like I think Nike actually came in on the tail end of that. So there was a splash 10-ish, maybe now more than 10 years ago. that direct to consumer won all the games, right? Because these companies, so like I'm thinking Warby Parker is like the biggest example. Like glasses used to be very expensive, quality glasses used to be very expensive, and there was no way you could get cheap glasses. And then Warby Parker cut out like all the retail, all the marketing, all the things, and just went, we're direct to consumer, just online, and we're all of these savings that we have, we're passing on to you by selling you much cheaper quality glasses, right? So there's like, a bunch of mattress firms that did the same thing, a bunch of other things. Amazon in my head is also that kind of thing, like, right? They were fully online, they didn't have brick and mortar, like all of that stuff. For a while, probably for a whole 5 years, they were really winning. These companies were doing super, super well, right? And then both other startups, right? So both other small companies decided to sort of join the crowd and do the same thing, right? And then also, it turns out that it's easier for Walmart to come online than for Amazon to create brick and mortar stores, right? So like it is like it took a while, right, for these companies to catch up, but they did catch up eventually. So suddenly the direct to consumer stopped working or stopped being a differentiator, and that's probably around the tail end of this being very successful is when Nike decided that they wanted to do it, right? So like it's not precisely a wrong strategy. It's just that they were kind of off with their timing.
So the write-up that we're referring to, and we'll put a link somewhere, is this LinkedIn write-up with the title Nike an epic saga of value destruction. And another related thing, and I think this is from the kind of attempt to go to this direct-to-consumer loyalty membership model. They spent, and this is discussed more thoroughly in the write-up. They spent all this money to drive traffic, right? They got on this metrics marketing vanity bandwagon, and they spent a ton of money, probably billions, although I don't have the receipts, to try to drive traffic to this thing that they were converting very, very little into actual revenue. So I think that's another thing you see. Maybe it's the zero interest rate phenomena. A lot of startups kind of went with this, like, we'll just pay for eyeballs, we'll pay for traffic, and not really have much to show for it in terms of dollars.
So I think this is like when you come back to tech, I think to me this is super evident in technical marketing or developer relations. Like people who drive these functions by metrics, and like look at only what you can measure, like it's just never successful, right? Like because like the value of such activities is so like there's so much intangible value in the like that brand recognition, in that like loyalty, in that perception of people that you're a good brand, that you're quality, that you're someone they want to follow or buy from. That can't be measured by like how many articles someone published, or how many eyeballs they got on particular talk or content asset, whatever. That like if you focus solely on things you can measure, you just end up destroying value.
I'm going to go back to my quote book. This is a Russell Aikoff quote. Managers who don't know how to measure what they want settle for wanting what they can measure.
There's an old, I don't know if this exists in other languages. Like there's an old joke about the drunk man is standing under a street light looking for something. Someone passes him by and goes like, "What are you looking for?" Like, "Oh, my keys." It's like, "Did you lose them here?" It's like, "No, I lost them way over there." It's like, "Why are you looking over here?" "Well, there's light here. There's no light over there." So it's kind of so. I think we spent a bunch of time talking about like sort of empowerment and encore type things. I want to bring it back to the tyranny of metrics, and sort of like the Nike story kind of plugs into that too. But there's actually a book, Tyranny of Metrics, which I think we did talk about it. I did actually explicitly mention it as a book you shouldn't read, because it's not bad. It's just a giant rant about how metrics are driving wrong behavior, which is true, but it could be said in like way fewer words. But but the guy there was specifically focusing on education and how education in the last even 30-ish years that he's been working in education, higher education, has been destroyed by data-driven approaches, because you create more and more data that you're tracking. So first of all, the test scores and the negative impact of just focusing on measuring the test scores and removing all creativity and the teachers have and whatever. But also the bloat of the administrative staff that you have to create to just measure more and more and more data about what you're doing, that like actually has no outcomes, nothing to do with the real learning outcomes of the students. So like he started writing the book because he used to be a dean of a department, and like he used to enjoy his work teaching students or organizing other teachers to teach students, and then he became started hating his work of generating more and more data about teaching students. And you can have to, because all of these, both the government and the rankings demand more and more data about what you're doing. So yeah, like it's almost like the digital transformation here is a culprit, because we created more and more technical ability to store data, right? To gather and store data, which empowers people to, look at all these metrics they couldn't look at before. And we both generate like too much information and also drive wrong behavior in many ways. I'm gonna stop.
But too much information and not enough insight is the problem. And going back to, that you have the same tension in that book that we've been talking about, where you have these teachers who are not really empowered to change the model or the metrics that they're going to be measured by, and then you have the system, the central planning, that is just going to drive everything into the wall because that's the model that they've decided.
And worse than that, they also so in education, notoriously, they change it all the time. So like halfway through the year, something changes. So like the teachers are not only disempowered of doing anything else except for what's prescribed, but also like what's prescribed changes all the time.
Yeah, again, so that, like, to me, this is another thing about how who metrics are for and how they're used, etc., is interesting here. So, like, if you look at things like Toyota Kata, one of the things that Toyota was trying to do was make scientific thinking, which is just, I have a hypothesis, I know something I have to measure in order to prove or disprove that hypothesis, and do that thing and get the measurement and figure out whether my hypothesis is correct. It's like basic scientific thinking. The goal of a lot of lean was to drive that scientific thinking as close to the work as possible, right? And so when you look at things like the growth of administrative staff, the growth of measurement in middle management, etc., you get this weird effect, which is those people are reporting. They don't have hypotheses necessarily with they're trying to prove or disprove with the metrics. They're just trying to report a metric system's outcome. They don't have a ongoing process that they're using to figure out, is this a good or bad metric? Should I even be measuring this anymore? All that kind of stuff. And also, because they're middle management, the time frame at which they're examining those metrics is delayed. They're not like measuring it quite quickly all the time. They're measuring it every month or so, in average and in aggregate. So you lose a lot of the weak signals by having these averages and aggregates. You also lose a lot of the interpretive power of, like, what does this metric actually mean, by giving that measurement to someone who's not involved in the work that's being measured, right? So, part of these, efforts of getting these measurement systems to work correctly is twofold. One is to move a lot of the measurement into the team with this kind of scientific thinking. And secondarily is to improve the middle management's understanding of measurement in the same way. Like, okay, so like It's fine for you to measure aggregates and averages over a longer period of time, but what are you looking for? What's your hypothesis? What do you think is happening in the organization? Why are you measuring that at all? Those are questions that need to be answered, as opposed to, again, this tyranny of the measurement or this tyranny of the metrics, which is like, oh, we're measuring that because my boss told me these are the things we're measuring, and I have to report every month about what they are. I don't know what they mean. I just know that if it's above this line, that's good, and if it's below this line, is bad. That's all I know.
Or not at all, just report it. But you also alluded to something else, which is qualitative, right? The stories are important. You should collect stories in addition to collecting data, because the stories are more informative sometimes than, and like those work in combination.
I'd be a little stronger than that about qualitative. Numbers don't mean anything outside of stories. The story, the narrative, the explanation, the hypothesis, the proposal, the strategy, that's what makes the numbers mean something. A bunch of numbers without a narrative associated with them, they don't mean anything. They're just numbers. And so, like, is it good or bad that this is going up or down? Why is it good or bad? All those things are narrative-based explanations of what the measurement is.
So both those things, I think there's two different things here that are both important. One is just narrative about what the metric itself is, like what do the numbers mean and why something is good or bad, because the same numbers, I don't know, like the reporting from the two big companies right now on AI was that we're spending a lot of money on AI, right? Microsoft and Google. And then the narrative that people wrote about is like, oh, that's great, they're spending a ton of money on AI. But you can also write the opposite narrative and say, it's not good that they're spending all these trillions of dollars on AI and whatever. So the narrative highly matters to how the stock market interprets the financial results, right? But also like the stories from the ground, like if you can't pull the anon cord, or even if you can, like maybe it's important for the CEO to hear the anecdote from the person on the front line about what's working or what's not working, or whatever.
Agree. Yep.
So I get this argument for a long time in the Agile conversation that really the only thing you need is to inspect and adapt. And I think that's the core of this kind of scientific approach that Jay was just articulating, is getting to the point where there's an open discussion about what does this number mean, right? Like my brain wants to make everything engineering, but like that engineering and science is really about stories too, right? Like what's the dominant narrative? And I wouldn't say this is solved, but how do you get those narratives to be meaningful, both up and down and across the org?
Yep. I mean, so like the first thing I think about that people mess up about inspect and adapt is that it doesn't start in the right place. So inspect and adapt means I have something, I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to decide what I want to do differently about it. That's not really a scientific process, right? They think it's empiricism, but it's not really. The scientific process starts with a theory about what I'm about to do. I write it down. I'm gonna do this because I think this is going to be the outcome. And I take it to someone else and I say, Andrew, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this thing, and I think this is going to be the outcome. And then I go do that thing, and then I compare the actual outcome to what the expected outcome was. And the delta between those two is actual learning. So like I learned something if it's different than my expectation, right? And why I say that is, especially in a metrics conversation, it's important to say what you think will happen to the measurement before you do something, because otherwise you'll just retroactively say, oh yeah, we totally meant it to do that. That's totally it was definitely going to go up or down.
Another one of my favorite arguments is that all these loops are topologically equivalent, right? So you have like, yeah, okay, this is more formally the scientific method, but all these looping, loop, katas, whatever, it's going to go through that same loop, right? So inspect and adapt is just like a super short version of it, and I'm kind of presupposing that you have some model and some narrative that you're trying to connect to that inspection.
But it's also like it's the only way to divorce yourself from the highest paid person in the room opinion, right? Like that hippo is going to drive all of your decisions unless you write it down. Because if you're conducting an experiment, you already have an assumption about how experiment's going to go, right? So if I propose an experiment and I think it's going to work and people reporting to me bring me the results, they will assume that what I want is X and then try to make the results look that way.
That's correct.
I won't name any of the guilty parties here, but I've actually seen someone pay researchers to come prove there's this hypothesis in the organization, and it's like the CEO level. And when they got back the results, they squashed the research because it didn't line up with the bias that they wanted to inject into the conversation.
So I think John Willis is in the background texting comments, and it was one of the things I was going to actually comment on when Sasha was talking earlier. One of the other, so we can have narratives about things, but another way to make a metric meaningful is to have an operational definition. And so an operational definition is just, so I like to use this one because it's from philosophy. How do we know how many bald men are in a room? Well, the first thing we'd have to know is literally, what does it mean to be bald? Is bald like you have absolutely no hair on your head, or do you have widow's peaks? We have to define what it means to be bald at all before we can even begin to count how many bald people there are in the room, right? And in philosophy,
every word needs the same thing, right? What's the person? What's the room? What's the
That's right. And you can imagine the result and the confusion that happens in organizations all the time is people go out and they in the same room, they count how many bald people there are, and they all come back with different numbers. And then they say, what the hell is happening right now? How can there be both 50 bald men and 3 bald men? This doesn't make any sense. You're all in the same room, right? This happens all the time in organizations where people think that the measurement that they're making is meaningful and that meaning is shared. In other words, that they're actually measuring the same thing across the organization when they're not at all. And all the standard metrics, right, that you can imagine, they all have these same effects inside organizations because they mean time to recovery. What does it mean to be recovered? When did you start the measurement? What's the lead time? There's just a ton of stuff that can change from moment to moment. And then you add in, not necessarily intentionally malicious modification, but maybe gaming of the metric. And my metric kind of favors really bald men as opposed to partially bald men because really bald men are better. So
I get bonuses. I get bonuses on the baldness.
Exactly. And so, I think that's another way of thinking about when you're trying to design a metric system, and we've talked about this a bunch with different clients that we have, there's how do you balance it, but how do you actually define the measurement so that everybody's talking about the same thing? How do you know that you're talking about the same thing at all? And how do you share
I don't think this is an event, right? Getting people to stay together, to stay consistent in their interpretation is an unsolved problem. And again, I drag things back to engineering, but I like to think of this as a cap theorem problem, which is this framing for how a database will either be consistent or available. And you have to make this trade-off in the tension between, are all of your people going to be consistent on all of these things all the time, or are they going to get any work done, right? And so finding that balance between, because every meeting is a write lock to your socio-technical system, right? So if you're having a all hands meeting as a global write lock for your organization, and then these team level things are happening all the time. So that is going to be tension to get on the same page.
That's one of the problems, right? The work is never done, and we want the work to be done, and we want to measure the results. We want to say, yeah, we've transformed, whatever, right? But there are certain things that you can never actually achieve. You can never get there. You can only keep being on the way there.
Asymptotic.
Now, trying to read the comment.
Yeah, and Barbara has this other one. I mean, I the way I describe this, and I've worked with Tiani on this kind of language before, is like, are your metrics for hunting, as in like I'm trying to find opportunities to improve or change the system? Are they for targets? Like I need to hit certain numbers. I need to know that I'm going to hit certain dates, certain times. Are they for steering, as in like, am I going the right direction or not? Am I using it more like a GPS or like, the way that a boat navigates? Like what is the point of the measurement? Like, how are you intending to use it? And who's the audience for it is the other question that, again, we talk about quite a bit. But again, if we have things like, operational definitions, does everybody in the room understand the same operational definition? And when we bring new people in, do they need to be read into the operational definitions of the measurements so that they know what's happening as well? I think these are all kind of interesting questions to think through.
This is the socio-engineering that has to happen to keep and one thing to make a comment of, and this observation from the arc of my own career, but I think it's true across a lot of things, that for whatever reason, there seems to be less and less emphasis on really training people into whatever it is, whatever the craft is. That training is something that happens outside of the work. And my belief that high performing organizations make, and this is like the whole organizational learning argument as well, is that you should get better at doing the work by doing the work. But also there's like this learning investment that organizations seem to have stopped making sometime in the last couple decades.
But also like not just that, but like the expertise. So like the Boeing story is extremely informative, right? Like the intentional driving out of expertise out of the company. Like some work you can only learn by doing the work, and you get better at it through years of doing the work. And there's a bunch of stuff like the
tyranny of MBAs. I think that's what we should call
reasons
it.
that people are hopping jobs more now than they used to. And it's like there's some good things about it, but there's also some bad things about it, right? When you no longer have people who are 20 years with the same company, especially companies that require a whole ton of expertise, like local expertise. Like again, you can't. How many companies build airplanes? Like how much airplane building expertise can you acquire outside of that space? And how much of that is really, really meaningful to how much quality you can generate. So yeah, it kind of brings me to my previous point from today, is I feel like the States in particular are progressively focusing on shorter and shorter timeframes, which I think the pendulum has swung too far, right? So like there is downsides to focusing on a super, super long time frame, but there's also a lot of downside to only seeing the super short term.
But it's predictable game theory that you have to report the quarterly, SEC market metrics, that you're going to have those timescales focused.
I mean, the other thing I'd say really quickly about kind of like mentorship and these ideas of apprenticeship and things like that is that in systems that traditionally had those things, the mentor was your boss. Like your boss doesn't go and hire a coach for you. Like if you're gonna do an internship as a new physician, like you're not gonna like get trained by not a doctor. You're gonna get trained by another surgeon to do a thing, right? You're gonna work directly with someone who has done the work before. And so much of what's happened in the Agile community, frankly, is everybody's been hiring coaches instead of actually expecting managers to help their own people learn how to do the things they're doing. And partially because their managers have also never done the work either. So you get this.
I think this goes back to your earlier point about the expanding administration of the metrics, and that you've evolved these structures where the managers are managing work that they could not do themselves, right? So that I think that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, but and like again, you get these coaches who please sit down and write me a function, or sit down and make me an object model. And they're like, no, I'm here to help you with your Kanban board or help you run your sprint. And it's like, dude, please, these people need technical skills. They need to be mentored in how to write software well. Who's doing that? Sorry.
So the other thing, and I think it's also related to data-driven, and like one of the reasons people hop jobs today is it's very hard to get a raise and promotion inside of a company. Like somehow we hire people at a lot higher salaries and levels from the outside with like 5 hours of interviews without knowing anything about them than we do promote them internally. And I wonder how much of that is also sort of data driven, right? Because like we are now in these big tech companies collecting so much data about someone getting promoted that it's a full-time job to generate the data that will lead to your promotion. So like on top of your regular job, you also need to do the full-time job of trying to create a packet of 100 pages of how like major your impact was across the company. Getting pretty wild.
Promotion, systems of promotion is a whole nother hour of ranting, I think.
Yeah.
On that note, we're at an hour and 5 minutes, and we probably should do other work. But I'd like to thank everyone for coming to another episode of us giving each other therapy about the state of the industry. Does anyone have any last words before I take us out and we go back to our own data-driven activities?
I think there's another episode in like John Wallace's last comment about fears of Gen AI and apprenticeship funnel, because I have opinions on that. So like, I don't know, maybe we should talk about that sometime because it's an interesting thing.
Maybe we should get John to come join us. And
yeah,
talk about
yeah. I think there's a like
impending collision of reality with the Gen AI enthusiasm.
It's very interesting what's going to happen. I would like to use my crystal ball to make actual predictions and see, if it.
We could frame it as a hypothesis and measure some stuff.
Yeah, we can collectively talk about Gen AI for a couple of episodes and see, if it holds up in a couple of years.
I think isn't that the only thing in tech that's like real right now?
Yep.
I'm gonna have to renew my Xanax prescription before we have those discussions.
And with that, I'll take us.